மீட் பண்ணிட்டீங்கன்னா ரெண்டுமே அன்மியூட் ஆயிரும்.
Good afternoon, students. Sorry that last time we had to break in between abruptly and for some reason. So we'll start from where we had left off last class. Before that, would like to know if any one of you have any questions to ask. I can give you another 10 to 15 seconds.
Hello.
Yeah, please.
So, is the last class you showed a few slides that were showing the data of rise in air temperature spanning over various centuries. There,
can you repeat, please?
In the last class, you showed a slide. Yes. It was showing the trend of rise in air temperature over the past few centuries.
Yes.
Yes, sir. There, see, if you really want to predict something in the near future, 50 years or 30, 40 years ahead, and if you still consider the data in this 16th century or 14th century, that may not be considering all the factors that we're contributing now. Because in the industrial revolution, automobiles, factories, many things have come in. So those factors now contributing more towards all those things. So in this case, selective reporting will not help.
Okay, if I understand your question correctly, you're trying to say that how can you extrapolate data from 16th or 17th century and then...
No, sir, it's not extrapolation. You have data, no, sir. For old centuries, still you have the data, no, sir.
We have some data over the century.
You have some data. It is getting some trend. Yes. But the recent centuries, whatever data you have collected, that is getting another trend.
Yes.
Now, when you plot, if you want to consider all points, so whatever the prediction you will give separate, and if you consider the recent data, maybe in the past 2 centuries, that will be a difference. This will be more accurate towards the prediction of this future temperature, no, sir. So in this case, selective reporting considering only few centuries.
That is
may
true.
not be good enough.
What you are saying is true. The present day data probably is more accurate and more predictive than the earlier data. Yes, that is correct. And so the trends which you see in the last few years probably indicate where exactly we are heading to, unless some drastic action is taken by the concerned by people. So I think that's what you are trying to say, right?
Yes, sir. So in this case, selective reporting will be of much help as compared to
selective reporting. Okay. Selective reporting. Well, I'm not very sure about this particular area. How selective? Of course, in case there is a selective reporting which is happening, it is definitely bound to affect the outcomes. And but in this kind of area, like I had shown that someone tried to selectively show this real data itself, where instead of showing over a large period of time, they had shown over a shorter period of time and tried to argue that there is actually a reduction in global warming. So that is not correct. That is like a selective thing. So whenever you do take data, I think one has to take care of a reasonable period of so that errors are not there in the interpretation of data.
Second question, sir. So I'm conducting some experiments, say for example, some 50 experiments. So whether I have to consider all the data points, or I need not do any filtering.
Okay, Mr.
May go wrong. I I would have done the experiment wrongly, I collected samples wrongly, then how to filter the data not required.
Excuse me, actually your voice is not properly audible here and you're speaking too fast. So I would suggest that can you please write down your question in the chat box and send it right away so that during the course of the lecture I will.
Now, sir, now is it audible?
Yeah. Can you speak a little slowly, please, so that I can get what you're trying to say?
Yeah. Sir, now, so I conduct few experiments, say some 50 numbers of experiment.
Yes.
I collect a lot of data. I want to report it.
Yes.
In few instances, there are chances that I have done the experiment wrongly, so I have got some wrong results. While reporting, shall I report all the data or I should do some filtering? Because there will be obviously some outliers. How to report this data?
Okay. What you're saying that you have done a few experiments and you would like to know whether you should report entire data in its entirety or remove the outliers and then.
Yes, sir.
At the first instance, I would say you cannot remove the outliers. Now, the thing is that during the course of the experiment and collection of data, you see that there are some outliers which you don't like. Then in that case, actually, you have to repeat your experiment. You have to repeat your experiment and see whether these outliers, what we have seen in the first instance, are they repeating at the same point or are they just random statistical errors? If it's a question of random statistical errors, then you have some reason that you can remove those kind of data because we have repeated the experiment several times and then you find that these particular outliers, they are not happening at one point the whole thing. They are coming up randomly. So in such a situation, of course, you can still afford to even out these things by trying to either statistically remove these outliers and then go ahead with your data. But then when you repeat data and you're finding that these particular outliers are getting repeated at the same points, then you have a reason to worry.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Okay, yeah. All right. So, so we now go ahead with the lecture, and I would like to just, since you have raised a very relevant point just now, probably I'll just quickly go through the points which I made last time. Let me see, yeah. So, yeah, I told that I talked about selective reporting and data segmentation. So I said that whenever people collect through experiments or whichever kind, you have all kinds of data. You have only good data, you also have bad data. But the general tendency with everyone is that they would like to ignore, the bad data or negative data, which is there for everyone to see. And this is a very common thing because nobody wants to say that I have bad data with negative data, just like the question which has been asked just now. But the thing is that there is a way one has to look at this negative data and then accordingly process it. It's not that you just push it away and brush it under the carpet. Okay. So, as I said, everyone wants good data, but then the problem is when you do a very selective reporting by intentionally removing the negative or bad data points, okay, they have called this replicability problem. I would suggest that everyone can mute their microphones so that it is clearly audible to everyone. Okay, thank you. So this kind of a negative reporting, selective reporting, where you brush away the negative data, it can give rise to what is called the replicability problem. And the replicability problem is more relevant to biomedical sciences. It is there, of course, in other spheres of science also, but it will affect the biomedical and biological sciences more because in these fields of research, very often you have live beings, either human beings or even animals being examined or experiments being done. So in such a situation, when you fall into replicability problem, there could be serious issues later because people who work on this kind of problems and would like to repeat or go ahead with this published data, which have been published earlier, they will run into this problem because they will also find that there are certain negative data coming out, which is not present in the published data. So that's how it is. And I also showed you briefly how this works, because once you have a set of data which are selectively chosen, then it can give rise to what are called false positive results. And the reason for this kind of thing happening is because either you have a personal interest in this data, or your funding agency is not, doesn't happen much in India, but in the West, quite a few private funding agencies, which of course would like their pound of flesh, and they will be after results which they like. Okay. So they are also after good data. So the pressures from both these points can come and resulting in positive results which are actually false. And of course, this will go ahead with publications, and then with publications we get citations, which again result in either promotions or further grants, etc. So the cycle will go on till at some point it breaks. Okay. So that's how things go on. And I also showed you briefly how you can make the outliers visible by showing you that data where you have some outliers. And since they are not fitting into your scheme of things, you would like to remove them. But then this is again not a good practice. You see, unless you have to repeat your experiments, check whether these outliers are, these kind of outliers. These kind of outliers are actually true, or they are just macro statistical errors, okay, or random errors. So then if you do that without any thinking, then well, you get good data and everyone is happy. But then you see you can run into problems later. So I also showed you a case of a drug trial where it's almost an equal, the trial showed a equal measure of negative and positive results. But then again, since the authors want to push for good data, they somehow try to brush the negative results under the carpet and then report only a few negative results. And again, they do something more on the negative results and try to convert the negative results into positive by again omitting certain outlying points or whatever the process. And then they can even go further by putting a spin on the data and then tone down the negativity further and show that you have all positive results. And then finally using citation bias, where you cite results which support your results, and then you can amplify your what are called your positive results so far. And hence you can see the difference between the beginning point and then the final point is such a huge difference. And you have effectively removed all negativity from your data points and then resulted in a very nice positive data. So then a person who looks at this final data set and then tries to replicate this kind of a measurement is definitely going to run into trouble, because he will never be able to replicate this kind of figure unless he is aware of the whole process which has gone into. Okay. So that is what is a replicability problem. So then I also told you about data misinterpretation, where actually the data which you show is correct. You don't manipulate the data, but then what you do is you manipulate in such a way that the axis of something you change, and then you make the data look different from what actually it is. Okay. So truncating axis or strategically picking the time periods, percentage changes, which I also showed you. So these are all methods by which you can actually project data which doesn't show its true colors. So this was one example which I showed you that, by simply suppressing, elongating this axis, you can make this curve look flatter visually. Okay. So see, again, the whole problem is people, if they are careful in reading the manuscripts, there are no issues. But then if you don't read the papers properly, just go by the data visually, then you may be simply misled. And I also showed you about another, of course, this was discussed just now at the beginning of this lecture. And yeah, this was done. And this was the point where we stopped, where I showed you that there's a misleading advertisement which shows that the product of one company seems to be having half the number of calories as compared to product of some other companies. Okay, because the graph shown here is deceptive, and it looks as if that it is only half the value of the other three data points. The problem here is that very cleverly the axis has been changed here. It doesn't start from 0 and start from some other number. So the data is true here, but then it is very selectively shown. Okay, so that people who don't worry about looking at the small print here will just look at this visually and say, oh, this product has half the value of the other three products. Okay, so this is also a deceptive way of showing things. It happens quite often, especially in the field of advertisement. Okay, so now we come to the question that whether can you prevent this kind of scientific misconducts from happening? And when I say scientific misconduct, it include all the scientific misconducts which I have talked about. So, as I said, this scientific misconduct, it can start from very unintentional errors, okay, and then also can go on to very, very serious scientific misconducts. And I also showed you that the transformation from an unintentional error, or what is called an honest error, can do this wholly serious misconduct is not a sharp transition, but it varies very broadly and continuously. And in one of the previous lectures, I showed you a graph where there are certain gray areas in the middle separating the good science and the bad science. Now, whose responsibility is it to control and stop this kind of misconducts? See, the scientific institutions themselves and the administrators, they have to take more responsibility in this regard and to ensure that, the research practices which are followed in the institutes and the environment which is present is ethical, and try to avoid all kinds of scientific misconducts. Okay. So the administrators of science institutions, etc., they need to worry more about this aspect because this is going to be more and more in the future. Of course, there are ways to check these things, but then see, nothing better than to stop the problem at its root itself. And again, the research community as a whole should take some collective responsibility, even though there are people who are carrying out scientific misconducts. Okay, people should not say that, look, I don't know about this person, he does scientific misconduct, I don't care, I won't look at him. No, it doesn't work that way actually in science, because it's everyone's responsibility, because at some point or the other, everyone will get affected. So the community must take a collective responsibility and try to ensure that people do not step out of the line of the ethical behavior. And in order to do this, there should be workshops and seminars and courses which should be organized at all institutions, time and again, not just once or twice, but time and again, to illustrate upon the causes for this kind of misconducts and what are the outcomes and what are the consequences, etc. So that is a very essential thing which must be done by all higher educational institutions. And as far as the serious, serious misconducts, which I said, fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism, they should have much tighter definitions, and so that you can actually bring on the legal aspect into the picture and take action against the people who indulge in these kind of scientific misconducts. And again, for the sort of less culpable misconducts, probably these definitions could be slightly relaxed if they are, as long as you are not very seriously deviating from the ethical behavior. And also this guidelines and regulations, they have to be simplified and made easily accessible to all researchers, even students. Okay, they should be able to understand what the implications are. See, it is very easy to put rules and guidelines in legal language and wash your hands off. But then it doesn't serve much purpose, because students also need to, and many researchers, they don't bother about legal aspects. So people should understand what these guidelines and regulations would mean, including those which have legal implications. So that's what it means, that research training must include ethical and legal issues. And supervisors and guides of young researchers, must take care and try to help them more in this regard. And as UGC is now trying to do, very effective and independent mechanisms, for investigation of this scientific misconducts must be set up at a national level. And like, for example, I have talked to you about the case of some vice chancellor indulging in plagiarism, so that there should be a committee which can have enough powers, etc., to take on any person, small or big, it doesn't matter, and there should be very effective mechanisms which can actually investigate these kind of scientific misconducts. And then another very serious issue is that the emphasis on publication of papers, emphasis on publication of a certain number of papers every year, which says that unless you publish so many papers, you will not be considered for promotion or whatever. Okay. So this publish or perish kind of an attitude must slowly come down, actually, because you see, there's too much emphasis on this publish or perish publishing requirements will naturally result in all these kinds of scientific misconducts. So people somehow there has to be a reduction in this emphasis, actually, so that you can have a more healthy culture of transparency and ethics can be easily established. Okay, so now I will go on to a slightly different topic, which are called ethical issues and ethical committees. Okay, so what are these ethical issues and ethical committees, and why do you need to know about this or talk about this? Okay, this basically, I would say that concerns more with biomedical research. Because the whole problem of ethics in science really, came about because of medical reasons. And I'll try to tell you in a short while how it has come about. It's slightly historical in nature. See, when you talk about biomedical research and ethics, okay, the first line of people which you can talk about are the medical doctors and researchers. Now, what do these medical doctors and researchers do, and what are the responsibilities? Okay, a medical doctor, what is his main obligation? A doctor is or should be concerned with the health of his patients, okay, the patient's well-being, and also try to improve the quality of life of a patient. When I say patient, obviously he is a human being who has been affected by something. his health or his quality of health is not proper. That's why he goes to a doctor. So the doctor's duty at that point of time is that he should be more concerned about the health of the patient and try to make sure that the patient goes back to good health and in the process improve the quality of the life. But the problem occurs when this person, the doctor, he tries to don the role of an investigator or a researcher, especially concerning, say, the trial of some new drug or some new medical program. So when a doctor is involved as an investigator, okay, in a drug research or whatever, there is something called a conflict of interest. And I will try to tell you what this conflict of interest actually means. And then, and why does this happen? Or why does this contradiction come about? Because doctor, if he takes part in a trial, he would be actually required to recruit patients for the trial. He has to generate the data for the study. He has to perform certain administrative issues also, and what are called non-therapeutic procedures, where you do a randomization of trials and administration of placebos. Placebos are what are called dud drugs. Okay, so you give the that placebo to a patient, and assuming that it's an actual drug. The patient feels that he's told that he's been given a drug, but actually that will not contain anything. It will contain zero drugs in that. So that's called a placebo. And then he should also try to follow very strict trial protocols. And then sometimes these things can actually result in the deterioration of a patient's health. So that is a conflict of interest here. So is it really possible for a doctor to fulfill this basic obligation of medical care and at the same time conduct clinical trials? Okay. So there is a document called the Helsinki Declaration, which came out in 2013. It says that it is actually the duty of the physician to promote and safeguard the health of the patient, and including those who are involved in medical research. So the physician's knowledge and conscience are dedicated to the fulfillment of this duty. So the doctor's prime duty always has to be towards the health of the patients, and even though their patients are involved in any trial, medical trials. So that is the bottom line which the doctor has to follow. And if he doesn't follow that, then he will be actually conducting a scientific misconduct. Then yeah. So then we have biomedical researchers. Who are these biomedical researchers? They are actually not practicing doctors or physicians. So they are basically like qualified in biotechnology or biomedicine and things like that. They have done the research work or done the PhDs, etc. So they are mostly involved in what is called biochemical research for the development of new drugs or vaccines. And again, this kind of research will involve clinical trials with participation of human subjects, and then naturally, once human subjects come in, you have ethical issues, and unless you are careful, you can get into unethical conduct. So what do these people do? They make available experimental drugs to patients with, say, end-stage disease. And then the question is whether such patients should participate in a clinical drug trial at all. And the other question is that whether the government should subsidize, experimental drugs for certain diseases, and but not for others. So these are again like you see a person who is really in need of particular drug, experimental drug, he is already about to die or something like that. So, and these drugs are very expensive. So should the government give a subsidy for that person or not? And but not for others. So this is an ethical issue. Okay. And so this is one kind of an issue. Yeah. See, whenever you go for a development of a drug, okay, it involves a lot of time and process. Okay, for example, this is the process for the Food and Drug Administration of the United States, where, and it's pretty same the world over, whether it's India or US, doesn't matter. And the time taken for approving a new drug in the market, it takes a lot of time. You start with, say, basic research, it takes up around 2 to 5 years in developing the drug. Then you have what are called preclinical testing, which involves animals or something like that. And then we have actual clinical trials, which take a pretty long time, even up to 9 years sometimes, which have again several phases. So you first do a testing in healthy subjects, then you do a test in individuals with disease, and then a larger scale of testing in individuals with a disease. So all this takes up almost 9 years. So finally, after all this, then you put up the drug for approval to the agencies, and they also take their own time, again, ranging from 6 months to 2 years. Finally, at the end of which you may have actually an approved drug. So it takes a pretty long time for a drug to be approved by any medical body. Okay, so how do pharmaceutical companies? Because of this long time, there are other issues, ethical issues. So, what are the problems which are faced by pharmaceutical companies? See, mostly, any business world, the goal of the industry is to make money out of their ventures. No industry in the world is there just for the charity. Okay, any industry is set up by someone so that you can make a profit out of whatever he is investing. But so when you talk about business ethics, there is no such thing as a business ethics. A business person always looks to make money, whether he follows ethical process or not. But the problem with pharma companies is quite different. See, as long as a company is making, say, steel or aluminum, it's a different thing. It doesn't matter much. Okay, if the steel gets damaged or whatever. But when you talk about pharmaceutical companies, the problem is quite different because these companies, they actually manufacture and sell drugs for the health of the society. And so because of this, there are issues which are called like the pharma ethical issues. And here the question is that can profit making be the most important concern for a pharmaceutical company if it, say, prevents people from purchasing life-saving drugs? Okay. What do you mean by this? Because a life-saving drug is always expensive. And pharmaceutical companies which take a long time in developing these life-saving drugs, they charge heavily for this and they try to make money out of it. So when they try to make money out of it, are they correct in doing it? Are they by putting a huge price on the life-saving drug? You are essentially putting a price on the life of a human being. So, do these companies have some kind of a moral responsibility to supply affordable drugs, okay, and to invest in developing treatment? So, this is a very difficult question, moral question. It is a moral dilemma, in fact, for pharmaceutical companies. And then there is something called a connection between the medical practitioners and pharmaceutical companies. This probably many of you would have actually seen because, a medical doctor who is supposed to take care of his patient, okay, you can always, you must have noticed sometime or the other that a doctor tries to prescribe a particular brand of drug or tries to send you for tests to a particular company and say that you have to go to this company, you have to buy only this brand of drugs. See, why is he saying that? Because any drug you take, there will be at least 3 to 4 manufacturers of that drug. And once you have that, there's a competition among them. There will be a company which sells the drug at a higher price, and there will be a company which will sell the same drug at a lower price. But now what the company which sells the drug at a higher price will do is that it will go to the doctor and try to influence him and give him maybe some monetary consideration and tell him that, look, you please prescribe our company's drug and we'll try to support you in some other way. So this is one problem. Okay. And you would have definitely seen this happening with whenever you go with the doctors. And again, when this same medical doctor, he participates in a program which is actually sponsored by a pharmaceutical company, there's a very, very distinct possibility of a conflict of interest and his professional autonomy getting compromised. Okay, and as I said before, possibility of a doctor prescribing drugs of a certain company under a certain financial inducement. So the Medical Council of India, at least it stresses on the fact that in dealing with pharmaceutical and allied healthcare industry, a medical doctor should always ensure that there should never be any compromise with his or her own professional autonomy or with the autonomy and freedom of the medical institution. So now what has happened is all institutions are required to set up what are called ethical companies. And when it comes to biomedical research, especially, according to certain rules called the drugs and cosmetic rules, all research institutions which deal with human subjects are required to form what is called an ethics committee. And this has to be registered with a body called the Central Drug Standards Control Organization. It's a governmental body. And so what is this ethics committee? This is a committee which comprises medical, scientific, and non-medical and non-scientific members. And what is their responsibility? So they have to ensure that the rights of the human subjects in the trials, their safety and well-being should be protected. And the committee shall be responsible for reviewing and approving the protocols, suitability of the investigators, the facilities used, the methods which are adopted, and adequacy of information to be used for obtaining and documenting what is called the informed consent of human study subjects, and adequacy of confidentiality safeguards. Now, in case if any of these are breached, so or any adverse event occurring to the subjects who are participating in the clinical trials, this ethics committee should analyze and forward its opinion as per certain procedures. So there's a well laid out protocol for ethics committees which are involving human subjects. And again, these committees must allow the inspectors who are authorized by this organization to enter the premises to inspect all the records, data, etc., and then give proper replies to all the queries which are raised by these inspectors. And that's one of the duties. And in case they fail to comply with any of these kind of conditions of registration, then the licensing authority, the CDSCO, that can simply withdraw the registration of the ethics committee. And once you withdraw the registration of cancel the registration of the ethics committee, that particular research may not be, it may not be possible to be carried out in that institution. So there are some these checks in place now, which can take care of this kind of issues. Now, why did all this come up actually? What was the origin of this? The origin goes back to the Second World War. The problem was in Second World War, the Nazis or the Germans at that time, especially the medical doctors recruited under the Nazi regime, they conducted some extremely inhuman experiments on the Jewish prisoners in concentration camps. As you all know that during the Second World War, the Nazis wanted to eliminate all Jews from the earth. And for that reason, they rounded up all Jews in the country or elsewhere, wherever they have occupied, whichever country they have occupied, they rounded up Jews and then tried to put them into concentration camps and then tried to exterminate them. So all these prisoners, including small children, they were forced into participating in experiments that were conducted sometimes without anesthesia, and they very often resulted in death, trauma, disfigurement, or disabilities, and which are now considered as absolute medical torture. So this all happened at that time, the 1940s, and after the war, of course, these doctors were captured, who could be captured, and they were tried for their crimes. And these trials were actually conducted at a place called Nuremberg in Germany. And this trial led to the establishment of what is called the very first code of medical ethics, called the Nuremberg Code of Medical Ethics. And this particular trial was called the doctor's trial, and that was the popular name. The actual name was the United States versus Karl Brandt. Karl Brandt was one of the doctors who was tried, and of course he was executed. So this was the doctor's trial which took place in 1947 in Nuremberg. And this was the origin for the very first code of medical ethics, which was called a Nuremberg Code. And what did this Nuremberg Code comprise? The very first thing was voluntary informed consent. What do you mean by that? When you say that it's a voluntary informed consent, the human subject must agree to his participation in a medical trial. Okay? And also that person must have a legal capacity to give that consent. And it should be so situated that he should be able to exercise free power of choice without any intervention of some force, fraud, deceit, etc., and any ulterior motive or form of constraint. And he should have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of the subject matter involved in the research, so as to enable to make an understanding and enlightened decision. So this requires that before accepting an affirmative decision, by the experiment, they should be made known to him what is the nature of the experiment, what is the duration of the experiment, and what is the purpose of the experiment. These three are very important, that they should be, the human being who is participating in the subject, he should be informed about. Then come the things like the method by which this experiment will be conducted, and then the means by which it will be conducted, what could be the inconvenience, hazards, etc. All these things have to be made known to that subject. And then what's the duty and responsibility for ascertaining the quality of the consent actually rests upon each individual who initiates, directs, or engages in this experiment. Okay. And so it's a very important property which is called voluntary informed consent. Then comes what is called the fruitful result for the good of the society. So any medical trial must result in a fruitful, anything which is for the good of the society. If at any point of time it is felt that it is not going to result in a proper, in a fruitful result for the society, then that particular experiment should be stopped. Because experiment should be such as to yield fruitful results for the good of society. Okay, and they should not be random or unnecessary in nature. Then we have what is called prior experimentation on animals, or what is called preclinical trials. Prior experimentation on animals and prior knowledge of the problem. So always there has to, before an experiment is conducted on human beings, one has to do the experiments on animals, and then with some knowledge of this natural history of this disease and the study, the anticipated results can justify the performance of the experiment. Then avoiding any unnecessary physical or mental injury. Okay. So during the course of the experiment, the subjects, especially human subjects and even animal subjects also, they should not be subjected to any unnecessary physical or mental suffering and injury. And then banning of non-lethal and disable procedures. So the particular trial should not include any procedure which could be termed as lethal, or which can have the potential of resulting in a disability to the human being, especially. Okay. So, so there has to be an experiment must be conducted whenever there is no reason for believing that death can occur or injury can occur. Then the degree of risk. Okay. So all the time when you do any experiment, you have what is called degree of risk and then the benefits, expected benefits. So the risk taken should never really exceed the benefits which are expected. Okay, and because of the humanitarian importance. Then proper preparations and facilities to prevent injury or death. So all these things must be taken care so that the human experimental subject must be protected against any possibility of injury, disability, or death. Yeah. And then performance of experiments only by scientifically modified persons. Naturally, these kind of experiments, especially when they involve human beings, okay, uh, they must be conducted by proper people, qualified people who are supposed to be doing this kind of experiments. Okay. Then these participants who are especially in human subjects, okay, they should be free to end the trial. They should be free to walk out of the trial if they feel that their health is being compromised or their freedom is being compromised. Okay. So during the course of the experiment, the subject, human subject, should be at liberty to bring the experiment to an end if by chance he has reached a physical or mental state where the continuation would seem impossible for him. Okay. So he should be allowed to go. And then again, finally, the experiments must be stopped if they are going to be too dangerous, because any thing which has a potential for any serious injury or death to a human being, that must be immediately stopped. And the scientists also in charge of this experiment should be also capable enough to judge that and immediately stop such an experiment which might result in an injury or disability or death of the human subject. So these were the 10 Nuremberg points, Nuremberg codes, which were formed at that time. So these happened to be the very first codes of conduct for medical research. And so this was a historical thing. Then, of course, followed many other codes like Declaration of Geneva. And these things, they keep getting updated time and again. Depending on the advancement in medical research, etc., etc. So they keep getting updated. And so this particular declaration has to be signed by the doctor himself, which says that, for example, he pledges to dedicate my life for the service of humanity, and then the health and well-being of the patient will be the first consideration, and all those other things. And then followed what is called the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964, which concerned human experimentation. And there was something called Declaration of Tokyo, which referred to human torture. And what was this Declaration of Tokyo in? That was human torture. And in this regard, there was an experiment which I would like to inform you. This was called the Tuskegee experiment. This happened to be conducted in United States. The most, the glaring example here was that this happened. This study happened from 1932 to 1972. Okay, and this concerned a very, very unethical experimentation on Afro-American patients who were mostly rural agricultural laborers, and they were not educationally, they were not very forward. And these experiments were conducted on this set of people. And there are roughly about 400 infected patients with the syphilis, which is a disease, and 200 uninfected control patients. And they were recruited for the program. The funny thing was, this program was fully supported and promoted by the US government, the Public Health Service. Okay. So the intention of the program was to examine the natural course of untreated syphilis. Okay. How, suppose if you don't treat a disease, a person affected with syphilis, what will happen? Okay. But then this was not informed to the subjects. They were totally unaware of the intentions of the project. And they were simply told that, okay, you are receiving treatment for some bad blood. But actually, in reality, nobody received any treatment at all, so including the infected. So the most serious thing was that in 1942, somewhere midway, just a few years, 10 years into the start of this trial, this drug penicillin was discovered. And it was known that penicillin will actually cure syphilis. But even after that knowledge, these set of patients were not given this drug. And that was the most criminal part of this whole project. And this study went on till 1972. Imagine 1972 is hardly 50 years from now. Okay, when already United States was one of the most advanced countries in the world. And this study was going on till 1972 and nobody knew about it. And finally it was stopped because the story somehow got leaked to the press and then that blew the lid on the whole thing. And then it went to a very serious extent that the President of the United States actually had to apologize on behalf of the government to the citizens. And I mean, if you read through this, you can see this, download this later and read through it. This, and just give you the first line. The United States government did something that was wrong, deeply, profoundly, morally wrong. See, it's very, very difficult to get an apology from any United States government official, especially the president. And so it is said this. It was an outrage to our commitment to the integrity and equality of all citizens. Okay. And finally, he said that the American people are sorry for the loss, for the years of hurt. You did nothing wrong, but you were grievously wrong. I apologize. I'm sorry that this apology has been so long in coming. And that's a very, very serious apology. So imagine that it could happen even in this modern world also, that this kind of medical misconduct or deviation of ethics in medical experiments. So that happened. And the other example which I wanted to talk to you was what was called the behavior of Unit 731. Unit 731 was actually a unit of the Imperial Japanese Army in the Second World War. And this was a medical unit. This was a medical unit. And they took a very a secret research program involving biological and chemical warfare. And at that time, Japan had occupied parts of China, and they conducted these experiments in the city of Harbin on human prisoners in China. And this was fully again supported by the then Japanese government, and they operated biological weapon production, testing, deployment, etc. And this research was actually conducted to benefit the Japanese soldiers. And why? Because they wanted to learn more about the ways in which human body can withstand hunger, thirst, and fight diseases. And there were weapons, biological weapons that were tested in the field of cities and towns in China. And the number of those killed is really not known. But the official figure is about 500,000 people. And so this was a very, very nasty program which was undertaken by them. Now, what happened after the war? These researchers, the scientists, some of them were actually captured by the Russians, because you know that at the end of the war, it so happened that the Russians and the Western powers, they simultaneously came into Germany and then captured the Germans, etc. And so some of these people were captured by Russians and they were, of course, prosecuted. But the funny thing was that those who were captured by the Americans, they were actually secretly given immunity, because the Americans wanted to know more about the experiments which these people had conducted. Even they were inhuman, even they were unethical. The Americans wanted data on the results of the experiment, because they wanted to use that data for their own biological warfare system. So you can see that war makes very strange bedfellows. So looking into all these things, one can talk about what is called banality of evil. And what do you mean by banality of evil? This was actually a statement made by Hannah Arendt, who was talking about this person, Adolf Eichmann, who was one of the prime persons involved in the extermination of Jews in concentration camps in Germany. So she wrote that evil becomes banal. What do you mean by banal? Banal is ordinary. So evil becomes ordinary when it acquires an unthinking and systematic character. So evil becomes banal when ordinary people participate in it, build distance from it, and justify it in a number of ways. There are no moral riddles or revulsions. Evil does not look like evil at all. It becomes faceless. Okay. So what was the reason for saying? Because she worked on this person, researched on this person, Eichmann, who was actually a very ordinary bureaucrat in German government, who actually, he was not perverted, he was not a sadistic person, very normal person. But then such a person, an ordinary person, he acted in such a way that he performed very evil deeds like rounding up Jews and sending them to their death. But he never had any evil intention. He just took it as a kind of a duty and said that, look, this is what I'm supposed to do, I'll do it. So a very ordinary person who was actually doing something extremely inhuman without any thought given to that. Okay, so there's a disengagement of the reality of his evil acts from his mind. Okay, so he never realized what he was doing because of an inability to think from the standpoint of somebody else. So this was the sometimes why people do unethical things or deviate from the ethical path. So this is one of the possible reasons it happens. Then coming to ethics and environment. This is also nowadays becoming a very serious issue. Earlier, no one really bothered about ethics in environmental issues. But nowadays, because of this global warming, climate change, and all those things, ethical issues have become very important in this area also. So, environmental ethics, as such, deals with the issues related to rights of individual, okay, that are fundamental to life and well-being. And what are all the different things which matter in this sphere of science? Like consumption of resources. Okay. See, what happens is that you'll find that people in certain areas, living in certain areas of the world, will consume food more than people in some other areas. That is because of a very unequitable distribution of food or something like that, resources. So there is a desperate need for equitable utilization of resources. And this equity disparity, we have what is called the northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere countries, and is very clearly seen that countries in the northern hemispheres are industrially advanced, they're well-to-do, rich, whereas the countries in the southern hemisphere, what we call the southern countries, there's a big imbalance in the same. So there is what is called an equity disparity. Then you have what are called as urban and rural equity issues. Invariably, you find that the urban people, they try to corner most of the resources, whereas at the cost of the rural. And then gender equity. This is also a very hot issue, and there's a need for gender equity. I don't have to say more about it. And then resources need to be reserved for future generations. There's another aspect which nobody probably bothers that much. The rights of animals. Earlier days, so many animals were killed. In India, tigers were almost hunted to extinction. So there is, fortunately, because of the Project Tiger program, we could save the tigers and then bring back the tigers from the brink of extinction. So animals do have their own rights. Okay? And then there has to be a proper ethics-based environment education and awareness. And then conservation also is an important thing which needs to be addressed. There's a lot of problem with conservation, climate conservation, and forest conservation, etc., and traditional value systems of India. So these are issues of ethics which concerning environment and which are now getting more and more prominence and funding from research agencies also. Okay, so that's what about ethics committees and then history of ethics, ethical codes and ethical research in medicine, etc., and environment. Then uh, we have what are called, we come to, so far what I have talked about was concerning research, how research is conducted, and what are the ethical issues which concern research, what could be the problems faced by researchers, both young and senior, and how they can be tackled, and what could be the consequences of misconduct, scientific misconducts, both for students as well as faculty and senior researchers. So all these things have been told so far concerning how research is carried out in our state. Now, next, I would like to talk about what are called publication ethics. And here, what concerns is that you have now carried out all the research, and then you have, whether it is ethical or not, it doesn't matter now. We assume that it is all ethical, and you have some set of results, and now you would like to communicate these kind of all these results. So now you go into the realm of the publication. Now, if you feel that all ethical issues are limited to the research methodology, etc., research conduct of research, it's not so. You face ethical issues in publications also. And I think in my rest of the next few lectures, I'll be talking about publication ethics, what are the importance of these publication ethics, what could be like research misconducts, what are called publication misconducts, and what are the problems which can, which our young people can face whenever they are coming across these kind of problems. So that will be the topics for my next few lectures. So this is the end of this lecture. So I would like to know if anyone has any questions or any doubts on the lecture so far. If mice imaging is involved in publication, is it mandatory to have animal ethics committee approval? Is it at an organization level and not at journal? Okay, I'll give you an answer straight away, which may or may not be correct, but I'll get back on this again. Whenever any live being is involved, whether it is animal or human being, the ethics committee will come into picture. So it is required to have, in my opinion, even for mice imaging, ethics committee approval. But I would like to inform you that I'll get back on this because I'm not a biologist, but I have a pretty sure feeling that you do need an ethical committee approval for this, and I'll get back to you on this part. Yes, any other question, please? If anyone of you wishes to unmute and ask, you can ask. Any questions, please? Okay, if there are no questions, yes.
Sir, with respect to this COVID vaccines, actually they not gone ahead with the trial 1, trial 2, trial 3, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, but it was implemented. Whether their ethics was relevant?
Yes, that's a good question. I was expecting that. Okay, this was a very, very unusual situation where one had to really choose. I mean, there was some, sorry. What do you think? Yeah, so the one had to choose between mass extermination of people who are dying like anything, and then whether any such possibility of stopping that disease from spreading. So the number of trials conducted for COVID vaccines, not only in India, but even in the West, they were what is called fast trials. So there were a lot of assumptions made, yes. There were a lot of extrapolations made, yes. And so truly speaking, the COVID vaccine never went through the detailed processes for which are really required for any particular vaccine. So that was obvious. Within 1 year, you could see that the vaccines were in the market, and so they were already administered to people. And it was also noticed that certain vaccines, fortunately not from India, but the other Western vaccine, some of them were not recommended later, and they were not very effective. But fortunately for us, probably our own vaccines were successful so far. But as you said, since they never went through the detailed trials, we really do not know whether there could be any long-term effects of these vaccines on humans. That, of course, is a subject of matter of conjecture. And I'm sure companies are involved in continuing that research on these vaccines so that in future, any such problem comes up again, so at least they will have a form, they will be on a form footing.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Oh.
Thank you.
Any other questions, please? Okay, so thank you very much, and we'll see you in this class.